UVA Darden.
Good Disruption, a lively discussion between UVA Darden School of Business professors Yael Grushka-Cocaine and Mike Lennox on cutting-edge technologies and practices that are challenging the status quo.
Hello, Yael.
Hey, Mike. Hey, Mike and everybody in the room. Hello, hello.
Now, usually we do our podcast, we're together in a studio, but it's a little bit different today. So first of all, where in the world is Yael?
I'm in Charlottesville. I'm, keeping the fort here standing. I'm back here in our offices. I miss being there with you in person, but I'm glad that we can do this podcast.
We miss you as well. I know you're vice deaning there in Charlottesville. It's our deal. I am here in our Sands family grounds in Rosslyn, Virginia, with our DC Tech Connect. And I have in front of me, a few of our students and alumni who are with us. So it's really excited to have them here for our podcast recording. All right, so I want to begin with a trivia question.
Oh, here we go. Okay, you're going to put me on the spot, yes.
I think you're going to know this one. What happened on November 30th, 2022?
Oh, yes, I remember. I remember the day that ChatGPT, OpenAI kind of turned the switch on for the rest of the world to enjoy their new version of their large language model. Is that the day? The day that my students looked at it?
Absolutely correct. 3.5 was released on that date. It was a seminal moment. The world changed. Everyone figured out about these LLMs. Just to put some numbers on it, within 5 days, they had 1 million subscribers. Within 2 months, they had over 100 million subscribers. It is arguably the fastest diffused technology, perhaps in the history of the world there. So just this seminal moment. A fun fact for you, 1 week before that, I had submitted my manuscript for my book, Strategy in the Digital Age, to the publisher. So guess what's not mentioned in Strategy in the Digital Age?
ChatGPT.
I do have, I did talk about AI and LLMs, but, timing was bad there.
I remember that day, Mike, I was in class and a student stopped me on my way out and he said, "Have you seen this? Did you see what it can do?" And he was sure that, he never needed to come to class ever again. It was very, very interesting. We had this really funny back and forth, the two of us. And I was like, no, the Socratic method is really valuable still. So I wonder what he thinks now.
We might want to talk more about that, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the history here, because as you know, as well as I, this wasn't like out of the blue, right? Sometimes it's treated as if somehow on that day, OpenAI invented, AI and large language models, but actually it goes back nearly 50 years. And so I'm going to, as I often do, date myself here. So one of the first, if you want to call it language models, wasn't nearly what we have today, was something called ELIZA that was available. I actually had it installed on my Apple IIe that I had as a teenager. And what ELIZA did was allow you to have the facsimile of a conversation with the computer. It was what we called expert systems. So what you would have is basically prompt response. A little bit maybe even like some more modern technology like Alexa, where you ask it the weather and it automatically kind of gives you a response to that. So
yeah, it was in the 60s. That was in the 60s, right? By the time we were studying some of this in our degrees that are kind of similar, you and I, these systems continued to evolve. Like in the 90s, they accelerated as well. I mean, we're not talking like, not even in the 2000s. We're going back to, the 1960s and 70s.
I always talk about how when I was a systems engineering student as an undergrad, I was learning neural networks. I was learning some of the backbones of AI. But we just weren't ready for prime time. So
I learned in my 4th year of my undergrad, I learned Lisp. Do you remember Lisp? Did you study Lisp?
I do remember Lisp. Yeah, of course. Yeah. Well, I was going to say, kind of two things happened. One, we started to apply neural networks to these language models in the 2000 period. Then there was this seminal advancement in 2017, where Google released a thought piece, a paper about these transform algorithms, if you will. And it really took off from there to again, this seminal moment in 2022.
Yeah.
So
What is that transformer piece? I mean, we were doing anagrams, we were doing like word to vec, all these things as data science was growing. What exactly did the transformer technology kind of add to the mix? Like, can we think about that? Like, what is the big innovation there by Google?
I don't know. So, but you're the data scientist, so then you could answer this for me. I'm a strategy professor at this point.
Well, some of it has to do with really how far can it go, right? When we were talking about natural language processing before these transformers came out, it was really about the next word, the next few words. It was really kind of piecemeal. And what really kind of really created like a jump in terms of the innovation here was the ability to do much longer paragraphs, phrases, pieces and articles. Like now you're putting strings together. Now it's not just one word at a time, one prediction, one P at a time, predicting what the next word is, but it's a bunch of these happening all together. And so the capabilities here of maybe what was very innovative, the neural network, was just now taking off like exponentially, right?
So I'm curious, how are you using LLM these days?
So in so many different ways, everything from, your basic workflows, which I think a lot of individuals are starting to do around like responses and letterheads and just starting lists of various kinds of various creativity, like parties or events and things that you just need to kind of, you need a partner, a thought partner to jumpstart you, to give you kind of a starting point. To looking through data and looking for patterns. I teach with it, I teach about it, and using it to basically allow my students to have a quick entry point into like data science. We teach it in our coding class to see how we can learn how to code faster. So it's really helpful for anybody trying to kind of master some entry-level coding. We insist that people understand the code, but this kind of helps them like find the right code way quicker. Anything to imagining my next cases and how I'm going to write them and teach them. So it's really been taking over my entire workflow in many different ways. What about you? Do you use ChatGPT?
This was in the early days, if you will, like 2023 or so. My niece was getting married and I was giving the blessing for the wedding. And I admit that I used ChatGPT for the first draft and then, of course, customized it and but it was very, very helpful. You mentioned a couple that I think are really fascinating to me. What we're now calling vibe coding, the ability to use these LLMs as partners with you for coding is just radically transforming the way we think about coding. I was talking to Phil Bourne, who you know well, our dean of the School of Data Science. I was asking, are we even going to teach like Python or Microsoft BI or Tableau or these different systems? And it's not clear that we even need to moving forward because you can now engage with the LLM and it can do a lot of that data analysis.
Well, in a way, and I'll be curious to hear your thoughts, but my sense is that some of that backbone is not necessarily going away, and it's still going to be very valuable and somewhat of a competitive advantage for somebody to actually understand what the LLM is running behind the scenes. So if I've asked it, for instance, today I engaged with a group that were coming up with predictions related to cars, whether cars were good or bad in terms of the quality. They ran the models through ChatGPT, through Copilot, through Gemini, but then the tools themselves generated Python code that it was valuable for those who understood Python. They could use that as a jumpstart to a much more sophisticated model. And so it still helps to be an expert. It's just that you're so much quicker to onboard, so much quicker to get started, and you don't have to search as hard, really.
I think gets to the second use case that I'm hearing a lot about that I think is really interesting, which is these use of agent AIs for things like consulting. And so the idea being that, if you're, an MBA graduate and you go into one of the big 3 consulting firms, you're going to be given an agent AI and they're going to be helping you generate your PowerPoint decks, do your data analysis and the like. So this, again, kind of co-creation that we're seeing with these LLMs. In some cases, it's pretty sophisticated analyses that are being done.
Yeah, and I know that we're going to get to the downside and the fears, and the world is filled with concerns and fear from these LLMs, right? They can also be the big bad wolf kind of around the corner. But on the positive side, wouldn't it be nice if those consultants that get paid a lot of money to do their work, wouldn't it be nice if they don't spend their time putting PowerPoints together, but actually spend their time talking to the people in the ground and understanding how to, utilize the workforce better, or working with the leaders in the companies they consult and, walk them through an implementation plan. Like, there's so much, I think, probably better ways to use those really exceptional individuals than sitting down creating a PowerPoint. So in that sense, I think that these are good transitions.
You're raising a point that I knew we were going to try to tackle here, which is this fear of a jobless future with the use of these tools and the like. And I think you highlight something that we have at least seen historically over arguably since technology began, which is as technology replaces human skills, we tend to then move kind of higher order human knowledge and the like that we're able to apply to either different decision problems. Like, what's your take on the jobless future worry?
Well, maybe it's not a huge surprise to those who've been listening to the podcast and to you and to the audience that I am I followed down on the optimistic side. I do think that there are some really interesting questions around governance and around thinking about how to integrate new technology into our lives. But overall, I am very optimistic in the sense that I don't think that this is a one swoop, it replaces all of us. I know, as you do, that technology and digital disruption requires change. It requires reassignment and thinking through the value and the workflows in an organization and thinking about how we operate and the operational model that we kind of deploy. And so I think it's just an opportunity to rethink a lot of the basics and to work smarter and work better in so many ways. So I'm optimistic on the opportunities here, knowing that there's work to be done. It's not going to just walk in there and everything will be solved. But I think that ultimately we're going to end up in a pretty good place. So that's my hope. Yes, there will be transition. There'll be some jobs that will, shrink in terms of the need and the demand, but there'll be plenty of new opportunities that will emerge.
To remind our listeners, the title of our podcast is Good Disruption. So we tend to be optimistic with technology than many, but that we do debate whether good, bad, or no disruption. Well, look, I think it's time for us to bring in an expert to help us with our thinking about LLMs and the like. And it is an absolute pleasure that I have with us today my friend, my co-author, my former colleague at Duke, Ronnie Chatterjee. Ronnie, before you say hello, just a quick introduction here. Ronnie is a distinguished professor of business and policy at Duke University. He is on leave right now, though, as the chief economist for OpenAI. In addition to this, you get to take a number of leaves, Ronnie. I'm very jealous of your business student to let you venture out in the world. He has also served on Obama's Council of Economic Advisor. He was also chief economist for the Department of Commerce under the Biden administration, actually leading implementation of the CHIPS Act. Ronnie is everywhere and knows everything, I think. So it's just an absolute pleasure to have him with us here today. So Ronnie, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's great to be here. An honor to be with Yael and you, Mike. And honestly, if that was true, if I knew everything was everywhere, ChatGPT should make me feel pretty worried as well, because it can do a lot of those things too. But it's been an amazing experience, a learning experience over the last year at OpenAI, and glad to share any insights that I have from that.
Hey, Ron.
So where are you in the world, Ronnie, right now?
I'm actually sitting in Mike Lennox's old office at Duke University here back. So that's home in Durham, North Carolina. So it really is full circle. And when I started at Duke, Mike was my senior colleague and really helped me adjust to the university, to being a professor, to thinking about the role in the world I wanted to play. And I think both, Mike and I, we wrote a book together. We thought a lot about the impact of business and society. And, working at OpenAI, where the mission is to benefit all of humanity, a lot of these themes, Mike, that you and I talked about over the years have come into full circle. And Yael, I know a little less, but I do know about her pretty amazing management ability and her ability to really get things done in organizations. And I will say that as someone who manages people and has to work in an organization, it's that part of my skill set I'm also getting to flex at OpenAI as well. So I really think we're going to have a cool conversation about some of this stuff.
Amazing.
Maybe to begin with, just tell us about your day-to-day a little. Like, what are you doing? You're the very first chief economist at OpenAI. So what is the job? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I think what happened early on is there was this sense of people who were closest to the technology, closest to building these models, that they were going to cause really a lot of transformation in the economy. And to your point about slow disruption, there's a lot of exciting things that can come from that. And there's a lot of things that are unexpected and that can be dynamic that we need to plan for. And so I think what happened early on is people said, look, we need to figure out what the economic impact of AI is. And mostly it was technologists who were thinking about this. And slowly it started to permeate into academic and business circles. And people started to kind of call on economists to come up with ideas around it. And there's a long tradition, Mike, as you know, of economists thinking about the impact of technology on jobs and on society. And in the AI labs, in the frontier labs, they wanted to think about this in a more rigorous fashion. They also had access to a lot of data and insight about the capabilities. And so OpenAI decided to create this position to allow an economist to come into the organization to analyze the data. And we've done that in a recent paper we can talk about in a bit, and also get closer to the actual capabilities, to really get close to the model builders and the people who are doing the post-training, the reinforcement learning, to understand where this might go, to build accurate forecasts and indicators to help people prepare. So that's why they have a chief economist. The way I've designed the job is probably, more emblematic of some of my own personal skills and interests. But really, that is why they designed the job, to find someone who could analyze the data, figure out what's going on with AI, and then build accurate forecasts and indicators to help people prepare for the transformation to come.
And do you, how much do you spend thinking about yourself as an academic versus an economist thinking about OpenAI problem? Like, can you easily separate what you know is going on and the franticness in which academia is trying to absorb some of this, or is it there in the back of your mind all the time?
It's always in the back of my mind. Yeah, I always thought it's so interesting to think about. We all wear all these different hats, and I realize at this stage of life and career, I'm bringing my academic insight into this organization. And interestingly enough, I think you both find this interesting. It's a very research-oriented organization. So in some sense, while people might say, look, you're a PhD, you spent a lot of time in academia, isn't it a strange transition to an organization outside of that? It's actually very natural. If you think about the people who are building these models and doing research on improving them, a lot of them have academic backgrounds, of course, in different fields than mine, close to Yael and other people who are listening. But these are people who are actually super invested in the scientific method, who understand research and its purpose. And so someone like me, who's a researcher in social science, I actually have a lot to talk with them about. And I find some of my best conversations are jamming about economics and technology with people across the organization. That part of the transition hasn't been as difficult as one might have imagined. And I don't have to check my academic or research brain at the door. In fact, it's always part of me in every conversation.
Would it be true, I imagine, that there's a lot of PhDs walking around the halls of OpenAI, people with, either computer science, data science backgrounds and the like?
Very true. Although not every researcher has a PhD or a master's degree. What's really interesting is, a lot of the work we've done in the economics of innovation charts the role of universities in training researchers and also contributing to innovation that eventually makes its way to industry. And with AI, there was a lot of early work, obviously, coming out of fantastic universities. But you really see now, in many ways, you mentioned the paper from Google, the frontier of a lot of the research is now being done inside companies, which I think is very interesting to think about why that is true about AI. It's something I want to explore in my research. And so I'd say a lot of PhDs running around OpenAI, a lot of people without PhDs, though, who are doing research in very technical areas, noticeably fewer, though, people with PhDs in social science, because that's kind of a newer thing. And so as a first chief economist, I feel like I'm often carrying the flag for the social scientists to make sure that that we're actually part of that conversation as well. And I think that's where, publishing papers, we released the NBER working paper called How People Use ChatGPT. I always like to have titles that tell people what the paper's about. So it's How People Use ChatGPT. And that paper has been just so interesting in building bridges across the organization, because people can see for the first time now, here's what economic research looks like and kind of work that this particular person does. And so it's been really fun to do that. And of course, it's engaged a lot of folks outside of the organization who have been relying on the data to make really interesting charts and visualizations and predictions about the future. So it's been a really amazing thing, both internally and externally, to write a paper like that.
So can you tell us any takeaway from that? So how are people using ChatGPT?
That's a good question. I shouldn't have buried the lead. So when I came in, the first thing I wanted to do, and I had studied how economists had worked in other organizations, I thought about what would be the first thing I would do or would want to do as an outside researcher, and going to Yael's point. And I said, look, we gotta write a descriptive paper about how people are using AI, because what's really lacking for a lot of the debates out there is the actual data on usage. A couple of other labs had released kind of interesting papers on this, or sometimes reports. And I thought, okay, this is really interesting as a start. What can we do to be part of that conversation? What can we do to enhance that conversation? So we took over 1 million ChatGPT conversations and used classifiers without actually reading the message to group them into different categories. And one of the key innovations we made is we were able, in a privacy-preserving way, to match those conversations to some demographic information. Things like inferred gender based on the name, things like occupation, role, tenure at company. Being able to put that together was really important. And I hear from academics all the time who say, the who and the what of AI is really important in your paper, and the first that's ever done that. And so that's the contribution, I think, to the field. The takeaways from that who and what analysis are the following. Basically, we find that ChatGPT messages on the consumer side, about 70% of them are for non-work uses, and 30% are for work.
Those wedding speeches like Mike we're talking about.
Exactly. Wedding speeches, recipes, fixing my daughter's bicycle. A lot of people came to us and said, gosh, that means ChatGPT, it's only 30% of the messages. Of course, we have 800 million weekly active users, so it's still a big number. But they said 30%, that's not a lot for work. It must be more useful for wedding speeches than it is for Excel spreadsheets. But remember, this paper is not about the enterprise chat data. It's not about the API data, which is obviously maybe the primary use in a lot of businesses. It's not Codex, which is the coding tool. It's not anything else. It's only the consumer. And so if I told you that a consumer product like TikTok or Netflix, 30% of your activity there was actually for work, you'd be pretty impressed by how productive TikTok and Netflix make you. So it's interesting to see the hybrid use of the tool, 70-30, non-work and work. The last thing I'll say is 3 broad categories what people are using it for: asking, doing, and expressing. Asking and doing being far above expressing. People are asking for information, for guidance, right, about what to do using ChatGPT. They're also using it, and this number should increase over time as agentic capabilities become more widely disseminated. They're using it to do things, end-to-end tasks. When you think about it like that, and our co-author David Deming has a great way of thinking about this, a professor at Harvard and another person who helped us really produce an academic-style paper, he said, look, ChatGPT is like a co-pilot. It's a co-worker. It's helping you accomplish things and inform your decisions, help you make better decisions. And that's quite different than the discussion right now when people think about AI in the popular press, where AI is really now so far a complement, not a substitute to what workers are doing. Now, to your point about good disruption, it's not clear if that will maintain or if that's always be the pattern, but I really thought it was important to get a snapshot of what's happening now with a large number of messages on the world's most popular platforms. That's the takeaway.
I love how you wove in that co-pilot there with the talk about ChatGPT, but we'll come back to that.
Yes.
As you may know, I lead a Darden, I co-lead institute, the Lacrosse Institute for the business of AI, the ethical business of AI. And one thing that we think about, and maybe a different kind of disruption that we're talking about, is also the business model disruption. So I don't know if maybe, I know that this is a little bit of an aside, but can we talk a little bit about OpenAI as an organization? Like, how much do you spend thinking about the organization of the future, the technology organization of the future? Like, right now, it's pretty cheap to use ChatGPT. I know that some people complain about the cost, but it's not as costly given all the value that it potentially can bring. What are the thoughts around disruption there for the business model of how this technology gets shared across the world?
So I'll say 2 things. One is, when you come into an organization, and Mike and Yael, you've taught classes like this where you start with the mission statement of the organization, and we teach it with a straight face, and we say this stuff really matters. And then sometimes you walk into an organization, and the mission is kind of an afterthought, or it's not something that really is alive anymore. And then there's some organizations, and I think you two feel this way about Darden, and I feel this way about Euclid. And to be honest, the mission actually does matter. People do cite it, they believe in it, and I think we're all 3 of us attracted to organizations like that. OpenAI is that kind of organization. And that doesn't mean, we always do the right thing or we're perfect or anything like that. What it means, though, is this idea of sort of AI to the benefit of all humanity drives a lot of decisions. So when, they decided to basically build ChatGPT, they had the API, they decided now to build this chatbot that ended up having 100 million users in 2 months. It was a really specific decision to make it widely available and free because they wanted everyone to have access to that kind of intelligence. So in terms of business model, like that really galvanized the very beginnings of this. And if you talk to people like Nick Turley, who was one of the early people who was the PM for ChatGPT, that idea of benefiting all humanity, it's still really important today and guides a lot of the decision. I think to your point, though, as things evolve, the question is, okay, what comes next? I think enterprise AI is going to be a really important sort of piece of the puzzle. I think we're in business school, so people like us really think about this. Your institute is about this. But I think a lot of people are not thinking hard enough about how important organizations are going to be in the diffusion of AI, the frictions in that last mile in deploying in organizations, and how, in many ways, right, the development of AI really runs through private sector firms adopting this and getting the ROI that they need. So I think the role of business schools, much to the contrary of the student who said he'd never come to class again in 2022, we're going to put it's as important as ever. Maybe we'll teach different stuff. We'll have a lot needs to contribute because there's no way that takes off without the private sector really embracing it and finding it useful, in my view. That's the underpinning for the infrastructure bet. It's the underpinning for the productivity benefit that people are thinking about from AI. How organizations adopt it, how they build on it, that'll really also determine some of the things about how OpenAI plays in the market. You can imagine a frontier model layer where we are building frontier models and other people are building on top of our APIs, building enterprise applications in specific verticals like healthcare or finance or law. And you can imagine a world where we build like general purpose technology that can be used in all those different areas. I think it's still sort of up for debate exactly which model is going to take hold. We'll also see different business models going the other direction of the value chain. You see us making deals, obviously, with regards to sort of semiconductors, be it energy. That's another angle to think about the value chains. I can think about like Mike Lennox teaching class 3 of the strategy course where he thinks about value chain strategy. OpenAI could be a case in that one as well, in a really interesting way.
It might already have been written.
So many things I want to do like a double click here. One of them is, where do you see the technology today and in the near future evolving? I mean, clearly this has moved very quickly, exponential improvement in the underlying technology. This has led to a lot of fear, but yet we're at a point right now where I'm almost feeling we're at that part of the hype cycle where, we thought we would be, AGI and the world would be controlled by these LLMs, and we're not quite there. So what's the current thinking around OpenAI in terms of that path to improvement that we're seeing?
I think it reflects on the biggest sort of lesson that I've taken, the biggest thing I've learned since joining. People ask me all the time, what's the thing that you changed your mind on, or what's the thing you've learned the most about? And I think understanding how quickly the capabilities of the models were accelerating is probably the biggest lesson for me. Being a professor, being in public service, I understood that this was a powerful tool. I understood some of the ways we could use it, but it wasn't until I really got into OpenAI and understood how the capabilities were moving against these evaluations and these benchmarks that are set that I really started to understand the pace of change. And so I think the attitude among folks who are seeing that data is that it is rapidly improving. We released something called GDP Val. So we have a fantastic team that does frontier evals. And what evals are, and there's really common in some parts of business schools and other parts not. I didn't know as much about evals when I joined. I think of them as basically, evaluations of model capabilities. When it comes to like a math quiz, you can think about evaluating the model in an objective way and figuring out how many problems it got right. When it comes to more real world tasks, things you might do, some of our MBAs might do, right? Working in finance or technology or consulting, you can give it real world tasks and ask AI to try to do those. What you're finding is in those real world tasks, AI is getting pretty good at actually doing things at a human level, or in some cases, be preferred to humans with producing a spreadsheet, writing a legal brief, doing a market research report. And so if you look at where it is today on GDP Val, roughly half of these, what you might call really important digital tasks in a typical white collar job, can be done by AI and preferred by humans, choosing the AI over human output in those cases. 50% might not be good enough in some jobs yet, but one thing to look about is look at that pace of change. Over the last year, it's been a straight up and to the left trend. And so if you think about building the models and continuing to do in the post-training to understand how to hill climb on those evals, you're going to see rapid improvement on these items. And so that's the thing that people are paying attention to. They're very optimistic about it. And honestly, it's a research agenda that people are excited about as much as like any point or outcome, right? Because at the end of the day, if we keep improving those capabilities, a lot of the changes that we're talking about in the world, the positive changes, thinking about innovation, curing diseases, right? Solving a lot of economic and social challenges, that becomes more in reach. So I think a lot of optimism, a lot of excitement, but also a lot of humility that the people who are doing this, they've seen their field transform in the last several years, and the impossible comes to possible. Everyone knows that at some point, there can always be a time where you're not making as much progress as you were before. And so there's a lot of humility around that too, and a lot of hard work going into it.
Any thoughts on the AGI question? Artificial general intelligence. There's a lot talked about it. I don't think I've ever seen a real current concrete definition of it.
You see different definitions. Like, the one that I've been working with is like the ability for an AI system to perform economically valuable tasks, like, that are not, a majority of economic tasks, but better than a human. You can argue what are economically valuable tasks and what it means to be better. I think the key thing for me is just because AI can do things doesn't mean it will do things or that we will let it do things. It could be that AI is really good at teaching my kid pre-algebra, but I still might want a human teacher for many, many reasons. And so I think if you look at autonomous vehicles, the capabilities of Waymo are incredibly high in terms of their ability to sort of do self-driving cars, but it's still not disseminated all over the world, right? So clearly there's some frictions in that last mile. And so I think the AGI debate and AGI as an endpoint is incredibly important, but what's also important to me is seeing that really powerful AI is being deployed in organizations and to improve people's lives. And that's going to be a really key focus, I think, going forward too.
I want to pick up on that and talk a little bit. In our podcast, we often talk about the good and the bad and, good disruption, bad disruption. And there are plenty of folks who have raised concerns and hesitations around these LLMs, especially when it comes, and maybe this relates a little bit to the autonomous vehicle example that you just gave, related to responsibility, liability, and kind of understanding the implications of the potential decision-making that ultimately these tools get to have once we empower them to make more decisions and not just generate insights or predictions. So what are you or OpenAI together, how are you thinking about those kind of concerns or that critique and like putting some guardrails or like what kind of things are you thinking about to protect us from some of the downside?
I think there's a few different ways. Some of them I'm working directly on, and other ones my colleagues are. So in terms of me working directly, when I came into OpenAI, I thought a lot about doing studies, which I've been doing, on the impact of AI on downstream outcomes. Let's say employment or sort of firm performance, and thinking about that as my primary role. When I got to OpenAI, I realized that you have a model that is talking to 800 million weekly active users, and people are asking it questions like, for example, around, let's say, financial advice or which things to invest in. And I thought, gosh, my impact as an economist could also be in helping sort of shape model behavior so that we make sure that it's actually giving the right kind of advice based on the first principles from economics and finance. And so for me, it's like thinking about evals and training the models becomes as important as the downstream studies I've been doing. So that's one way I've been thinking a lot about. For me, in particular, the advice getting factor of AI is really important. I've written a lot of papers on how advice impacts entrepreneurship. And I think advice is one of those things that is really scarce. And if we could, good advice is scarce. Maybe advice is not scarce. Good advice is. If we could scale good advice, think about all the businesses, particularly in emerging markets, but here in the US too, they're stuck between small and medium size that aren't growing, is they can't afford a big consultant, right? They can't afford to hire an additional person. What if you could put that advice and scale the intelligence that we have into AI and deliver that at a much lower cost or even free? Those are the kind of things I think are really, really important. Those are the kinds of things I think are going to make this a good disruption if we can scale. Because I think when we get overly focused on sort of the disruption piece, we sometimes forget that there's lots of people who don't have access to these services to begin with, who couldn't afford a consultant, couldn't hire a financial advisor. That's where AI becomes powerful. There are other folks, deeper experts than I, obviously, on these issues who are working on AI safety. It's a big priority and really animates the whole mission of OpenAI. Safety can come in many different ways, all the way from national security to sort of protecting our users. And you've seen a lot of our public sort of writings on things like syncopacy and emotional dependence. That's a key part of the work at OpenAI. And the last piece is just making sure people have the skills they need in the new economy. Regardless of how quickly the transformation goes through, we want to make sure that people learn skills and they can match to jobs that are requiring those skills. And so we announced a partnership with Walmart to work on certifications around AI and hope that we can use those to make a more efficient matching market for employment so people can get the skills they need and then get jobs that they would want to use those skills at. So those are some of the things that are going on around the company. Definitely a lot of interest in this, animated by the mission and a lot of partnerships, which I think is good because, obviously we don't have all the knowledge on this stuff in-house.
Yeah, Jack and Rick come to mind, that your colleagues at Fuqua who are experts in advice taking and giving. And I can imagine that line of research really informing some of that. So thank you.
For sure. And I encourage, I think if there are researchers out there listening to this who want to engage on some of these topics, we obviously have worked with a bunch of academics already. We're running, field experiments with firms. We're, writing papers like how people use ChatGPT. We're doing more practitioner pieces with things coming out in the next year. So definitely reach out and let us know if you want to work on things.
That's great. I see Mike has some questions from the crowd, right?
Do, and one I wanted to follow up on anyway. So Ronnie, you and I wrote a book a few years back now called Can Business Save the Earth? Trying to be provocative here. We talk about climate change, we talk about clean tech, renewable energy, and the like. And we're at this incredibly interesting moment where there is a massive build out of compute to meet our AI needs. And we need water, we need energy, we need electricity to power these. I mean, we're sitting here in Roslyn. We can kind of see Tyson's Corner, not quite resting, but we're almost in the center kind of where a lot of this build out has historically taken place. You mentioned it briefly in your comments. Can you just talk a little bit about how OpenAI is thinking about the need for compute, and then of course the energy and everything that needs to come along with that to have sufficient compute power?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'll be brief, but this is a huge issue. We just do another podcast about it. When you think about all the things I've done in my career, from the book we did together to the CHIPS Act, this work at OpenAI kind of connects all those things. So we're talking about the full stack of AI infrastructure, starting from developing the energy from clean and renewable sources, all the way to, powering these data centers that include the GPUs and high bandwidth memory and the things I was working on when I was in government, all the way to sort of the training and inference required on the frontier models at places like OpenAI, and then into enterprise applications and the kinds of things that I've been teaching my MBA students about for a long time. So it's all connected. I think I see a couple things that are really interesting to focus on. One is, there's been a broader sort of push for electrification that's creating more demands on the grid already, and investing in the grid and improving it. And we were talking about this even in our book, Mike, and it's becoming more and more important. The other place is sort of thinking about how quickly we can get energy generation set up and connected. You guys are, I guess, in the PJM area, right? We're one of the hot corridors when it comes to this, and where there's a lot of data centers. And so you're going to see massive investments in these data centers around the country and around the world. So we're going to have to think about how we can do these things more quickly because to meet the demand of what's going on. Secondly, I think because so many of the hyperscalers and OpenAI are so committed to doing this in a sustainable way, you're going to have pushes for more innovation in terms of how we do things like cool data centers, for example, or recycle water. And so what's interesting to me is when I talk to engineering students at a place like Duke, where they might not have been talking about sort of, the power efficiency of chips or how to save more water at a data center, those are now topics that there's a lot of interest behind, a lot of venture capital money behind, a lot of research dollars behind. So that's the hope, is that we can drive a lot of innovation in this space. And actually, some of the things that, around the energy transition and beyond are happening because of these big investments. At the same time, it'll be different in different parts of the world. And so you're going to see a different mix in different parts of the world, different approach to doing this. And so that's also interesting to remember. The U.S. is in isolation as we're thinking about how we develop this infrastructure.
Just a quick follow-up on that. One of the ways, obviously, that we could improve this problem is just the efficiency of the ability to do LLMs, right? The processing efficiency there. Can you comment at all about kind of where we see the trajectories there? Is this a case where, we'll have dramatic improvements in our ability to produce the compute we need for a given unit of output of an LLM?
Yeah, I can't say that I'm deep on terms of right now the technical work being done around this, but I do think even just routing your queries to the right model could make a lot of sense. Like you think about, when I used to use deep research in previous iterations of the model, right? And now, if it's bundled in together in a GPT-5, when I have a particular query, does it need to go to, which model to really give me the answer I want? Can I specify, hey, this is the kind of answer I want, in a way that's also sort of maximizing efficiency? These are the things I think are going to be really, really important. And I think there's going to be huge opportunities, both at the frontier labs, but also with a lot of intermediaries. We're going to build businesses around this. I think it's a really interesting space, but that's what I know based so far.
And what I like about that vision is that it would require both the organizations and the developers of these models and the users to kind of invest in this education so that the end consumer is aware and knowledgeable so that they use the models more efficiently and that benefits everybody, right? So I like the idea that if we're efficient, the organization is going to be efficient, and then the infrastructure will be better set up to support it, right?
That's so interesting. Yeah, and it actually relates to a lot of the early work that Mike and people in our community, I guess, did around kind of giving consumers information at the point of sale in those cases about sort of environmental impact, things like that. It's a really interesting. It sounds like a good class project too to explore. So very exciting.
I've had a question from one of our audience members that I thought is provocative, and I'd be curious your response to it. What are some ways to prevent AI from overshadowing our own authenticity and uniqueness to the work we do and create?
It's a really good question. I think about it a lot, right? When the machines are ascendant, we worry somehow that humanity in a zero-sum game has become less valuable. I think it's interesting to think about, though, that the machine is also able to do things that can level the playing field and make humans actually more valuable. You think about how many people, they open up a job listing and it says, hey, you got to learn how to code or know how to code to do this. And now somebody can say, well, hey, I might through vibe coding be able to, do what is needed in that job. Just like when we remove college degree requirements from job descriptions, we find people who do the job that we or there's a chance that actually more people will be able to express themselves in humanity in this world. It's also interesting that people now can complement their skills. If you think about someone with an idea who wants to make short films, and now they can think about using the tools with Sora rather than a lot of other expensive equipment to kind of make their dream into a reality. At the very least, creating some template to visualize what it would look like before they move on to more sophisticated technology. So that's really interesting to me. And I feel like these are places where we can express our humanity more. Finally, and this is actually what Yael was kind of saying to the student back in 2022, which I believe too is, and I think Darden and Fuqua are particularly adept at this, which is, just because we have massive open online courses, right? Mike has taught these, Yael's probably done it, I've done it. It doesn't mean that human experience at a Darden or Fuqua is less valuable. I'd argue it might be more valuable. And I don't think that necessarily that's true for every school, but for the places that are providing the really great in-person human-to-human experience, people might be craving that and valuing that even more in a world where these things are happening with machines at the same time. So those are the things that make me optimistic. But I also understand the concern and skepticism, and that's why humans have to be in a loop at every step, make these decisions in a small, democratic way, and it will be different around the world. I think that's really important to remember. I go to I travel to 10 countries in 10 months, and the attitude towards AI differs sharply around the world in ways I think are going to manifest themselves in interesting patterns going forward.
I can see that. Yeah.
Which gets to another question. This might be a more difficult one to answer, but in the kind of geopolitics of these systems now, and how there is this kind of mad race, especially between the U.S. and China, to develop out this technology. I was in a conference in Europe recently. The Europeans are all worried because they don't have their kind of big LLMs being developed per se. Maybe if you just reflect from an open AI perspective, do you talk about this? Do you think about this? Or is it more just like, we got our job and we're, kind of working on that right now?
I mean, I definitely think the core job is to build really fantastic tools for our users, right? And making the product work better. And of course, developing the frontier intelligence that makes it all go. So that's definitely the core. I do think though, the geopolitical backdrop is really important for all of us to remember. If you think about the development of AI in a very provincial way, let's suppose just your community or just your country, you may miss that there are other places that are making different decisions that can affect yours. And so you think about issues around safety. It's going to be really important, right, to make those decisions at the local, state, and national level. There's also a broader issue about whether those decisions align with what people are doing in other parts of the world. We might seek to say, hey, we don't want to use AI in this instance or that instance, but it doesn't guarantee that they're going to make those same decisions in other parts of the world. And the other place it really matters, which is not my area of deep expertise, but of course, it's the national security and defense. And so to the extent that AI is leveraged in those applications, it really, really matters who's doing what in those capacities, who has access to the world's leading intelligence. And so these are things we have to think about, as well as navigating the challenges in our own local context about how we choose to use AI. And I think it just expands the conversation. There's not an easy answer to it, and I think your conversation in Europe reflects the ones I've had where they're thinking about, hey, the most powerful models being developed places outside of Europe. What does that mean for us? There's also a really great opportunity in Europe to build on top of the models in really important applications that are key in Europe and build great businesses around those. I think there's some reason for optimism there too. But this is the conversation around the world that's happening right now.
I don't know if you have you read this book, AI Snake Oil?
Yeah.
So the premise here by researchers at Princeton, part of the premise is that the invention, what you're doing at OpenAI, is really the core technology, the capability that's being developed by OpenAI and other companies in the space. But the question is, like, where is the application, right? Where is the kind of the business kind of specific application going to come from? Because that's when it's really going to take over. That's going to prevent it from becoming really what, live up to all the promised, unless it's really implemented in the next level of applications. Is it the Walmarts of the world? Is that where we're going to see some of that come from? Or are there new companies that we're going to see emerging that are going to kind of make that their mantra? Like, I wonder how you're viewing that.
I see it both ways. It's a great question. I think that there'll be some leaders in their industries who are going to really work on this, get this, figure out the right workflows to use AI on, do the kind of change management. Another reason we still might want to go to business school to learn how to do these things.
Yeah, you need project management for that, right?
You definitely need it. You can't just drop these things in and expect the whole, company to change. And I think people are finding that out, right? And so I think it will be some of the leaders in their industries who are doing this. But I also think it's going to be some really exciting startups who really don't have to re-engineer workflows because they're starting from scratch. So they can start from the beginning and build a workflow around AI. This is what you call these AI native startups. A mix of those companies, of course, it'll differ by industry, are probably going to be the ones to kind of get to where we need to get first. And I agree with the idea that, as enterprises adopt AI, that's where we're going to really unlock a lot of the value people have been talking about. You're talking about the growth in terms of, let's say, GDP from AI. We're mostly thinking about firms becoming more productive using AI. We're obviously seeing a huge investment from the CapEx side that's also impacting GDP. But what we're really thinking about with growth in AI is firms adopting and using it. I think it's an important step. And so that's a space I'm watching. And there could be particular countries, geographies that are really sort of disseminating AI more quickly and getting more people to use it for useful things. And that could be a huge advantage in the future. So that's why I think we got to make sure that we get the technology in as many hands as possible so we can figure out what those uses are.
Thank you.
I always like to point out when it comes to digital technologies, whether it's the personal computer or the internet or now AI, there is often a significant lag before we really see productivity gains in the economy and a true impact on like GDP in the order of sometimes like a decade plus in some of these examples there. So it might be too early yet to fully see that impact from ChatGPT and these LLMs. I have one more question here from one of our audience members. I really like this. What do you see as the bottleneck for realizing full impact of these systems and AI at this point? I'll just share that, when I talk about like AI winner of the 1990s when I was a student, we always talked about we didn't have either the data or the processing power. So if you look forward now, is it data? Is it the building of data centers? Is it processing power? Is it we need a new algorithm? Like, where do you see the things that might constrain us moving forward?
So I'll answer this and also pick up on something about your last point about when it shows up in productivity statistics. What's really interesting about AI, and our paper kind of documents some of this, is I think a lot of the value is in what economists call consumer surplus right now. A lot of the things, like if you think about AI informing a decision that you're making, and now you're going to make a better decision, or you're giving that wedding speech and you're saving time you would have spent on that, and now you can do something else. That doesn't show up in GDP, but that is improving your life. And that is what economists usually think about in terms of consumer surplus. And so there's a lot of positive consumer surplus from AI. Eric Brynjolfsson and co-authors have written about this and estimate, it could be $100 billion a year from AI, just given what people would be willing to pay to get it back, that kind of idea. So I think that's interesting. And I think when you bring that to the enterprise, it's creating value, but maybe not in all the ways that people can see right now. I think the biggest barrier is probably is their organizational willingness to prioritize these projects and go beyond pilots and really re-engineer or reimagine the workflows in their organization. I think if people are stuck in sort of the SaaS model and they think they're going to drop this in and all of a sudden see magic, it's probably not the right approach for AI. And I think that's what makes it different. And so I think that while some companies are unlocking this more over time, and I think that's really the barrier, the friction, are going to figure this out. And when I join a lot of calls with our folks who are working with our largest enterprise clients, I always kind of upgrade my probability of success if I see more senior people on the call, which might be interesting, right? You think it's the junior people who are more tech savvy, but the more senior people are able to really prioritize these AI projects. They're able to pick the right implementations. They're able to scale the pilots. They're able to do the change management that you really need to make sure AI implementation sticks. When you see that in organizations or the leadership commitment, then I think your chances of success are a lot higher. There is a lot of work to do, but I'm pretty sure the biggest friction is time.
And that's be interesting because it's the domain expertise. Those senior folks have the domain expertise. When I meet with organizations and talk about AI, I often hear comments around like, yeah, we're just going to hire a 25-year-old and tell them to go and do it. Like, that's not going to be the way to onboard AI in your organization, because they don't know the business. And you need to know the business to know how you can change and break the business to start to leverage AI, right?
I agree. That's been our experience.
Yeah.
I always say, we need digital champions, those people who can be translators between the ability of the technology, but understand the business function, exactly to the point you made there. Well, Ronnie, we're out of time, but any last words, any last observations for us before we end?
Well, first, just thank you to Mike and Yael for welcoming me to the podcast. It's interesting me to be here and exciting. So I've always had such great experiences interacting with Darden and the University of Virginia, and having been to the campus that you're seeing at, Mike, a couple times. It's a fantastic space. So I'm really glad the space you're creating digitally, the space you're creating physically, and all the amazing things you guys are doing in the world. Hope to come back for a future episode and we'll talk about where AI is then.
Hey, Mike. It's good to reflect on our wonderful conversation that we had with Ronnie the other day.
Yeah, this is great. We've had a couple days to reflect. We're back in our offices now. The big question, good, bad, or no disruption? What do you think? These LLMs.
Yeah, LLMs. I think we all can agree that there is a disruption happening. I think we feel it, the panic in the air, the enthusiasm in the air, even the doubt in the air comes hand in hand with big disruptions, right? Like that we've seen historically.
Yeah, I totally concur. I think it's interesting. Like, is it overhyped? Perhaps. But as we talked about, I think there's already enough evidence to, I think, officially declare this a disruption.
Yeah.
The amount of adoption, and even though it's not penetrating every industry and every sector, there's been enough that are already like widely adopting this that I think it's, like I said, it's fair to say that the disruption has begun.
And so, I think I was probably already sold before we talked to Ronnie, just because I am intrigued by the opportunity and the capabilities that these models bring, and the imagination, how it gets people excited to think about what is possible. So while I think like any disruption, any good disruption, there are, of course, ongoing ethical questions and environmental questions and impact questions, and it's not going to be purely good across the board. But I think in totality, this is a shift for the better. This extends our capabilities as humankind in many interesting directions, and that we're just finding out. But for me, it's a good disruption overall.
I'm aligned as well. It's challenging whenever we have a new disruption. In many ways, it's human choice that decides whether it's good or bad. I guess I have faith in humanity that we'll navigate this. It will create some challenges, ethical challenges, use cases. The idea of being addicted to your LLM is something we're going to have to head on. But what often happens when we have these disruptions is there's this coevolution of the institutional environment and the technology itself. And I think we're just at the beginning of that with these generative AI and LLMs that, I remain optimistic at this point that we're gonna get there, that we're gonna get to a more positive space in the adoption of them.
Yeah, I agree. And I'm hoping that some of the concerns that we see, or some of the open questions that we're debating or that we're concerned about, how do we provide energy to data centers? How do we have enough water? How do we figure out some of the infrastructure? We talked about those in our podcast in the past, and other types of disruptions that have come up. But this is a good excuse, a good reason, a good motivation, a good real enhancer of those types of solutions. And I'm looking forward to us getting closer and closer to getting our hands on how do we make energy more available, more distributed, cheaper, and less problematic.
See, your systems engineering roots are coming out here. Like, everything is a giant system, and maybe we should do a podcast just on good disruption, everything that's happening right now. How is the system going to advance here?
Exactly.
But again, I'm aligned as well that I think, all of these problems, not to be too Pollyanna, but we will put our attention to them. We will hopefully make some progress on them. And it's a unique time to be living right now especially with AI.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks again, Mike, for having Ronnie and for allowing me to join your conversation. He was great.
Of course, of course. Well, as always, I want to thank our producer, Gary, our chief researcher, Becky, and the entire team for bringing you good disruption. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
Good Disruption is a podcast from the University of Virginia Darden School of Business.
Darden.